Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on classics in neuroscience. In this series of videos, we have started looking at neurosurgery and how neurosurgery was developed by Harvey Cushing and further developed by Wilder Penfield. In this video, we will look at the seminal contributions of Harvey Cushing. It is extremely difficult for one individual to single-handedly establish a subspecialty or a subdiscipline of medicine or surgery. But if there was one person about whom you can make this claim, that was Harvey Cushing. Harvey Cushing alone, perhaps single-handedly, arguably single-handedly, established the discipline or subspecialty of neurosurgery, a field on its own. So, we discuss his extraordinary contributions in this video. As I mentioned, it is very difficult for one person to essentially single-handedly establish a field. If you summarize Harvey Cushing's life, you have essentially summarized the establishment of neurosurgery as a clinical discipline, because that is how phenomenal his contribution was. He was super focused on this discipline, and so much so that he was not focused on anything else. He was laser focused on this, and in this he was the expert, world renowned expert. He was a leader and he was a teacher for generations of neurosurgeons, including the famed Wilder Penfield. We discussed that later. Harvey Cushing was born in a family of physicians in Cleveland in Ohio in 1869. His ancestors for generations were physicians. So, he did his undergrad at Yale University and went to study medicine at Harvard. So, he was an intern at Massachusetts General Hospital, and later, because he was excited by the extraordinary environment, extraordinarily stimulating environment of Johns Hopkins University, he became a resident at Johns Hopkins University, Johns Hopkins Medical School and Hospital in 1896. There he trained in surgery under the stewardship of William Halsted. William Halsted was famous or renowned all over the world for bringing in a rigorous approach to surgery. So, during his formative years as a resident working with Halsted, perhaps had a important effect on Cushing to develop rigorous methods, perhaps just guessing. So, he took over prodigious amount of work. Harvey Cushing was practically performing most of the surgeries being performed in Johns Hopkins. So, he became Halsted's chief resident and also an instructor of surgery. He was taking over a huge amount of load of surgery at Johns Hopkins. In particular, he was interested in neurological cases. In particular, he started focusing on trigeminal neuralgia. One of the many people he came across in the fantastic academic and research environment that was Johns Hopkins was William Osler. William Osler was a very friendly personality who attempted to help people. He shared a great interest in medicine and surgery with Harvey Cushing, but William Osler was also interested in other things, unlike Harvey Cushing, who was only interested in surgery. That is important. Each one has their own advantages. So, William Osler being senior to Harvey Cushing and Harvey Cushing taking a particular form of liking to William Osler, listened to William Osler. So, William Osler advised Harvey Cushing that at the end of the training, he suggested Cushing to spend some time in Europe and learn about the scientific advancements and the clinical advancements from the established renowned centers of medical learning in Europe. Because in the good old days, more than a century ago, Europe was the center of the world at that time. This was, late 1890s, early 1900s. We are speaking about the year 1900. So, at that time, Europe was the center of the world, or so it can be claimed. So, Cushing took some time off and traveled to Europe and went to several leading labs and several leading clinical centers in Europe and learned from there. In 1900, Harvey Cushing met and discussed with Victor Horsley about the possibility of working on neurosurgery, but was somehow not super enthused by the work and the standards that was there at Queen Square. Remember, the appointment of Victor Horsley to Queen Square is considered a milestone in the development of neurosurgery. But for Cushing, that environment was not particularly stimulating because there was a lack of standards. Look, from the beginning, Cushing was someone who loved standards. He was looking for standards, or he was looking to improve standards, or he practically set the standards. This is how it was for Harvey Cushing. So, he was not particularly impressed or enthused by the standards at Queen Square. So, after visiting London, he proceeded to Switzerland, where he worked with Kronecker and also with Kosher in Bern in Switzerland, where he focused on the brainstem control of blood pressure under conditions of increased cranial pressure. In the good old days, this was a very, very important problem that was being pursued. So, this idea of control of blood pressure under conditions of increased cranial pressure had important applications in identification of pathologies affecting the brain, or essentially neuropathology. So, he continued these kind of studies. He actually visited Mosso. Remember Mosso, we discussed his contributions in the previous set of videos and also in the previous video. He visited Mosso in Turin in Italy, who was a legend working on the same problem, because Mosso famously worked on cerebral blood flow, remember. So, he continued working on the same problem using her extensive observations of cerebral blood flow in people with head trauma. We have discussed this. So, he received extraordinarily high quality training from individuals such as Kronecker, Kosher, Mosso, and later he went to Liverpool, where he worked with legendary Charles Sherrington on mapping motor areas in anthropoid apes. So, mapping motor areas in the cortex in anthropoid apes is not directly related to human neurosurgery, but it was instrumental in his development as a great neurosurgeon. And of course, working with a legend like Charles Sherrington would have also given him the due experience that helped him develop this field. So, later, after his 1 year extraordinary stint at various places, sometime in Switzerland, sometime in Italy, and sometime in Liverpool. He returned back to Johns Hopkins to work with Halstead again. So, at the age of 32, he was appointed as associate professor in surgery department with a specialization to head the neurosurgery department. He just asked Halstead that, give me this title of neurosurgery. Then Halstead said, okay, this field is yours. Or this is how it's mentioned in the textbook. Amazing, right? So, he practically co-founded the Society for Clinical Surgery, and he asked Halstead for neurosurgery, but then practically there were no patients of neurosurgery at that time, because in the good old days psychiatry dominated this set of fields more than neurology or neurosurgery. We have discussed this before. But there were still some problems, there were still some challenges that required the development of this field. The actual applications were to come about a decade later once the war broke out. We discussed that later. So, he started working on removal of brain tumors, intracranial tumors, and he worked on a dozen cases. And later he delivered an address on neurological surgery. This address that he delivered at the neurological surgery, in which he outlined the vision for the future of neurosurgery, was published in the bulletin of the Johns Hopkins Hospital. The title of this journal looks more like an internal publication of the Johns Hopkins University, as if no one else would read it. That is how it appears. However, remember, Johns Hopkins was at the time a leader in the field of medical studies. So, it had quite a bit of readership. This journal had quite a bit of readership. So, in that article, Cushing essentially lamented about the fragmented state of neurological surgery, and he lamented about the practical lack of expertise and coordination during surgeries. He suggested that such a field of neurosurgery should be built on clinical neurology, neuropathology, and experimental neurophysiology. Combining knowledge and information from all this and coordinating would help in making this field of brain surgery a lot more rigorous. This was his vision for the future. Let us just take a step back and look at this. An amazing vision for the time in which he lived in, 1905, 1906, before 1910, to come up with this vision that you need to have clinical neuropathology, clinical neurology, neuropathology, and experimental neurophysiology as the foundation stones to build the discipline of neurosurgery was an extraordinary vision to have. And if you build a discipline such as neurosurgery on these foundations, it will obviously be rigorous and improve patient outcomes. So, this was the vision that he practically outlined in that article that he delivered at the neurological surgery and also published in the bulletin of Johns Hopkins Hospital. Later in the 1910s, I think in 1911 or 1912, he was appointed head of surgery at the Peter Brent Brigham Hospital. Great position in the field of surgery, perhaps in entire America for that age. And in 1914 to 1918, he helped with the First World War, and there was plenty of opportunity to deal with patients of head trauma. Unfortunately, Many of the soldiers who were wounded in the head, and there was plenty of opportunity for Cushing to perform surgeries on soldiers with head traumas. And there he delivered a phenomenal 7.4% mortality as opposed to 50% mortality recorded in other places where the war was going on. He was essentially serving in France, if I remember correctly, and a lot of generals, a lot of war generals would ask for his surgery for their soldiers. If any of their soldiers were affected in the head, they will request specifically Cushing to be the surgeon. Such was his fame during the time of war. The French generals and colonels would request specifically for Cushing to be the neurosurgeon, Cushing to be the brain surgeon to perform the surgery on their soldiers. He was so famous among the higher military officials for his extraordinary performance. In one of the meetings in 1919, Harvey Cushing presented his results showing just 7.4% mortality rate in patients with head injury. And at that time, William Mayo, one of the surgeons in the audience, stood up and applauded and said, "Gentlemen, today we have witnessed the birth of the new field of neurological surgery." Let me read the exact words. "Gentlemen, we have this day witnessed the birth of a new specialty, neurological surgery." So, such was his contribution to the field of brain surgery and neurosurgery. Saris, in one of his works, mentions the specific contributions of Harvey Cushing. I will read from the text. "It is rare in the history of medicine for one individual to almost single-handedly develop and advance a specialty, but such can be said of Harvey Cushing in the years approximately from 1900 to 1930. During this 3-decade interval, Cushing established that brain tumors could be resected with reasonable safety and helped design and implement equipment and techniques that made this possible. In these 3 decades, his success is reflected in operative mortality rate for tumors such as meningiomas, which dropped from 25% to 12% to 4%. So, mortality rate in meningiomas dropped from 25% to 4% during the period during which Cushing was active as a brain surgeon. Many contributions that he made, he himself identified some of these. The innovations he identified that made brain surgery possible in this field: decompression to relieve tension and irreproachable wound healing, and importantly fine black silk sutures for closure of the gallia to avoid fungus development. And later the use of local anesthesia, which was exploited by one of Cushing's student, Wilder Penfield, to explore the cortex, for example, and ventriculography, Dandy's idea of ventriculography, and also motor driven suction apparatus and improvements in the methods of not homeostasis but rather hemostasis. And also he himself practically developed or co-developed the electrosurgical devices such as electrocautery, called as Bowie's electrocautery. John Fulton was one of the trainees of Cushing. Of course, he also trained with Sherrington. He performed research on non-human primates. In addition to all this, something that is often overlooked is his contribution of bringing in Riva Roche's manometer, sort of a sphygmomanometer, to the United States from Italy. Of course, this was later modified by the Russian Korotkov, who went on to identify the famous Korotkov sound. But until then, the idea of using a manometer to measure blood pressure was unknown in the United States, something that is often overlooked. Among his many contributions, this is something that is often overlooked. So, his work in humans, also his training of, for example, John Fulton, who worked on primates, he himself also performed surgeries on apes with Sherrington. All these things led to the development of the field of behavioral neuroscience, because performing these surgeries on animals and animal models and then performing experiments on those animals after surgery, before and after surgery, helped identify important functional aspects of specific regions of the brain. So, this gave rise to the field of behavioral neuroscience. So, with this we come to the end of this video. In this video, we looked at the phenomenal contributions of Harvey Cushing. I have actually not covered all the points. I request you to please do read up both the textbook and also the Wikipedia page of Harvey Cushing. Amazingly, Harvey Cushing was nominated as many as 38 times for the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, although he was never awarded even once. But it is amazing that one individual could be nominated 38 times to the Nobel Prize. Such is his contribution to the field of neurosurgery. With this, we come to the end of this video. Thank you for your attention.